Welcome to Ask AI, the podcast that brings you insightful interviews and news from the world of Canadian artificial intelligence. This episode is sponsored by Microsoft Canada. Microsoft is committed to building trusted and responsible AI systems. To learn more, go to microsoft.com/AI and check out their free AI business school to start building intelligence into your solutions today. We're also sponsored by Cinchi, the global leader in data fabric technology. Visit Cinchi.com to learn how to eliminate integration and turbocharge your AI transformation.
Hey there to all of you AI enthusiasts. My name is Jackson Kahn, and I am the host of the Ask AI podcast. Very excited to be bringing another episode to you today. Also a reminder that we are doing team check-ins. So if you're listening to the podcast and you'd like to get your team featured, we're very happy to do a check-in with you to profile a bit about you, your company, your organization. So give us a shout at info@askai.org, and we're very happy to contact you about that. So today we're very happy to have with us Anna Kazantseva. She is a research officer at the National Research Council of Canada, where she is part of the Indigenous Language Technology project within the Digital Technologies Institute. Anna works in the area of natural language processing, a subfield of artificial intelligence that focuses on facilitating interactions between machines and human languages. Anna first became interested in preserving Indigenous languages as a master's student, and she continued that research as a PhD student at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to Ask AI, Anna.
Thank you, Jax. Thank you. I'm really honored to be here.
Perfect. We're very happy to have you. And to start off, I'd love to just dive into your personal journey into artificial intelligence. And so wondering, first off, how did you get involved with AI and what was your path to AI?
It was a little bit circuitous and accidental, actually. I originally came to Canada to grad school intending to work on programming languages, but I took a course in natural language processing, and I liked it so much that I switched the topic of my then master's thesis, and then I continued on to PhD.
That's fantastic. And so from your PhD, where did you move on to next?
For my PhD, actually, as well as for my master's, my topic was a bit different because I was working on processing literature. It was a while ago, about 2010, and the computational methods that were available for technical texts or literature were not the same. For literature, there was much less available. So I worked on short stories and novels. And then in 2015, I joined the NRC.
Okay, really interesting. And so you mentioned that your graduate studies involve processing literary works. Is there anything specifically that involved in the context of machine learning AI?
Yes, although it was a little bit, the methods were a little bit different than what I use today. But definitely, it was AI. So I basically, in both my master's and my PhD, I was interested in how to make, because I like books and I like to read. So I was interested in how to make literature as accessible and as easy to search for and as easy to use electronically as, say, news were. So for my master's, I worked on kind of helping the reader decide before reading a story whether it's a story that is likely to interest them or not. And then for my PhD, it was a bit more technical. I was working on how to kind of automatically determine the structure of novels, of chapters and novels, kind of make an automatic outline with a view of maybe later creating summaries or somehow processing it further.
I always find that kind of work around summarization or highlighting to be extremely interesting because there's so much information out there. And I think a lot of times we're desperate to get a sense of it rather than to, have to sift through everything. So that's really, really interesting. And specifically on natural language processing, was there a part of that you found particularly fascinating?
Yes, I always have found it fascinating. And, there's a lot of interesting things, and there's so many new technologies now that it's like being in a candy shop, really. But I think for me, what I always liked best, one is working with language. I love the fabric of language. I love seeing how people's feelings and thoughts can be expressed in language. And it's really fascinating to see how it can be manipulated, to manipulate, say, public opinion. So I like language itself, but I also really like the engineering aspect of natural language processing, of NLP, because you can just build things and try things very easily. And I just think it's really interesting.
Yeah, there's so many different applications of it. I'm always really fascinated by what it can do. And particularly from what I understand about your background, I'm really interested because I haven't heard anything about this before, but I'm interested to learn about the Indigenous Languages Technology project and to understand more about it and potentially what technologies you've applied there specifically.
Okay, well, the Indigenous Languages project is probably my favorite topic because I've been working on it for the last few years, except I was on the maternity leave for a little bit. But the project, we started kind of the makings of the projects were internal to the NRC and just internal almost to our two text processing teams when we were talking and just kind of thinking that we work with language and we work with many languages spoken in other countries. Like we have work processing Arabic and Chinese and obviously French a lot and other European languages. But then we were just kind of thinking, well, there's so many other indigenous languages spoken in Canada. And at that time, we had no idea really how many. Can we do something for those languages? And the internal management approved the project to go further. And in the end, in 2017, Canadian Heritage, they wanted to work with us and they wanted us to do further research. The goal of the project has been always kind of to see what the indigenous communities and what the people who do language revitalization, what they think would be helpful for them and kind of work along those lines. So although I still, it is the most important principle, but in practice, the languages are so different depending on who is counting. There's between 50 and 90 languages, actually, depending on what you count as a language versus dialect. So there's many languages and they're extremely diverse. It's not like, we cannot speak of them uniformly because the languages spoken on the West Coast in BC are so vastly different from Inuktitut spoken in Nunavut or from Mi'kmaq spoken in the East that, we cannot use the same technologies, but the languages also differ vastly in terms of the number of speakers, of how active the language revitalization community is for that particular nation. So different people need different things. And this resulted that the project is kind of composed of rather many almost seemingly unrelated parts, but it's just because, different communities need different things. So we have tried to involve Indigenous experts and teachers and learners, and so that their voices would be heard and their opinions would be important. And it kind of worked in several ways. First of all, I think in every project that we have worked in, there's an Indigenous person or several involved guiding us. But except for that, we also gave funding to several communities to specifically work on creating, usually it was various archiving and training specialists in the community to archive linguistic material. So in some communities, they would record the elders, sometimes audio, sometimes video. In others, people were working on transcribing the audio or video because it has to be done in a fairly particular way for this to be maximally useful for the future and accessible to as well machine learning methods. Yeah, so kind of we're going along those lines.
Well, there's so many aspects of that sound so fascinating. One of the parts that I'm most interested in is definitely around, the diversity of languages. I think you mentioned some very large number of the number of languages there are. My understanding there are dozens or even hundreds. And I also understand that, in terms of languages being endangered, there are many languages that are endangered or of even potentially being lost. Is there any work as part of the project or any thoughts on how important it is to protect those languages?
Well, I of course think it's extremely important to protect those languages. I think all but three Indigenous languages in Canada are considered endangered, and the three are Inuktitut, Cree, and Ojibwe, just because there's a larger number of speakers, but it does not mean that those languages still need support, in terms of teaching, and also in terms of, and that was one of the goals of our project, actually, that I forgot to say, it's to make Indigenous languages in Canada as easy to use on your computer or on your mobile device as it is easy to use English or French, or other languages. So in terms of preservation and revitalization, I think, first of all, it's important because the Indigenous communities think that it's really important. It's a huge part of cultural heritage. And, sometimes my own research I focused mostly on Mohawk. And, there was a moment when I was learning the language. I never became fluent. I never got as far as I would like, but there were times when it would bring tears to my eyes because of the structure of the language, because it focuses so much on who is related to who is doing what to who, and that I just like, it's so, it's so different. It's so much about relationships and community. And if the language is lost, then all of that is lost, and a lot more is lost. So I certainly think it's extremely important to preserve the languages and to support them. And, as an immigrant, I'm an immigrant to Canada as well. It's so interesting when you go places and you see signs in an Indigenous language. And at some point, my daughter was asking me, Mom, can I take a lesson in Sinchofan, which is a local language here where we live in Saanich, BC? But she couldn't, because although there is a school, it's very small. And of course, the priority is given to the Indigenous families, and there's never enough funding. So I think it would be great if we all could learn more about the languages that were spoken where we live for literally thousands of years. It would be so amazing.
I definitely agree, and hopefully projects like this can help us. I was also interested to hear, you mentioned you were directly involving some Indigenous elders and different members of communities in that process, in the project. Could you detail a bit more about that, and maybe also speak to how this project could help reconciliation as a whole?
Well, with the elders, it's less frequently that we meet directly with elders, but we usually more often work with somebody younger from the community who consults the elders on a regular basis. So it's usually done like this. And, in many communities, the elders who are fluent speakers, that quite often, past 60 or even older, and their time and attention is extremely sought after because there's not many people left speaking the language. So basically, we don't want to waste their time. So the community decides how to use that time in the best available way possible. But in several of for example, in my work in Mohawk, the person that I'm working with, he's regularly consulting several elders in his community when he is in doubt about how certain things should be. We work on a verb conjugator, so he's consulting about how a particular verb needs to be conjugated. In many different communities, people worked on recording elders, recording their stories, and as well specifically recording the linguistic material and making it available. In a little bit of a different vein, this is not directly working with elders. Part of our project is on making available recordings that already exist, making them available, because it's kind of counterintuitive, but there's a lot of recordings. For example, a CBC at some point had programming in Inuktitut, so there was a lot of recordings that were there, but it's quite expensive and difficult to process audio because basically you need to listen for hours and hours, and you have to specifically find the part that you need. So part of our project is on, it's not really full-blown speech recognition because that will take longer. It's quite difficult and ambitious, but it is indexing of those Inuktitut recordings and kind of keyword search, basically. It's imperfect, but it's better than nothing. And it starts making those recordings available. Another part of the project about availability of recordings is quite often when people are learning a language, especially in an online course, and now especially during the pandemic, it would be really helpful to hear how something is pronounced. And again, in many communities, there's available recordings and text. But if you're reading a story and you're listening to a recording, it helps, but it's not as nice as if you are looking on your screen and the story, there's a running text and the story is spoken and each spoken word is highlighted. So we have a technology like that. And the best part about both of those technologies, especially the later, which we call read-alongs, that it scales very nicely to new languages. So we've done it, I think we've done it definitely for over 15 languages and possibly even more. The keyword search is more challenging and it requires more data. So I think we've only done it for Inuktitut and Cree, and hoping to, in the future, if we have funding available, to extend it further.
I'm just so fascinated to learn about sort of all the different parts of this. And there's so much to discuss. Another curiosity I have is that often, we consider language is critically important, but that a lot of, we also know that a lot of human communication, even in oral history, can be nonverbal. It can be about facial gestures and hand movements and things like that. And I'm wondering if that's encapsulated within the project as well, and if there's any consideration of that within the project.
For now in our project, unfortunately, we have not considered it just because of resources, basically. And
Okay.
there's so many languages that we have not even been able to work on. The vast majority, we've really worked on a small part of them. But also, I think generally the state of the art in NLP is such that non-verbal communication, there is some work and it's very fascinating, but it's not quite as robust as language, as say text processing is. So it's perhaps a little bit early to use it right now, because also, for the indigenous languages in Canada in particular, time is of the essence. So it's important to do what will help and not what is only a cool research project. So we kind of, whenever in doubt, we decided like that, unfortunately, but it would be very interesting to work on it.
Yeah. I didn't know or even necessarily think it might, but I was just curious. I do think that, with all the other applications of AI, in terms of facial recognition and gesture tracking and things like that, I thought, there might be some applications. Who knows? Maybe you'll be able to get more funding for the project and gather that information as well. I wanted to ask you too. So, there's all this great data, this tracking of languages and more. And I'm wondering what you might think about the future prospects of your work and projects like this. Is it possible that they could contribute to some indigenous languages making a bit of a comeback within society and even to, kind of grow or allow that language to evolve even more?
I think, it's not very flattering to my ego, or I think most of our egos, but I think really, this language revitalization as a process, technology is only a small marginal part of it. And we realize it. What really matters is how the languages are supported and funded in the communities, how well immersion schools are supported and funded, and how well the learners are funded, because it's a very, learning an indigenous language when you were born, even if it's your national language, but you were born as an Anglophone or Francophone, it is a very daunting task, because the structure of the language is quite different. All of them are quite different from English or French. So basically, most of it will be determined by, not by technology, but by other things. But I think technology can help once people already have a little bit of the language, and then maybe it will help them, type more easily, or read more easily, or write more easily, because when you're struggling with a new language, that's when technology really can be helpful. As well, I think it can certainly have a place creating curriculum materials and creating teaching materials, which as well, it's quite difficult for many teachers now, we've been told, because there's not many teachers and they're involved in the classroom, but creating curriculum materials is a very time-consuming and extremely important work as well. And here, technology, I think it could play a role. I think it would be really ideal if the technology was handed, if it was either developed by the communities or handed down to, given to the communities, to their ownership, so that they can decide what they, how they use it, what they do. And it's been as well a guiding principle of our project. So for now, we don't know if the project will be refunded, because unfortunately the funding actually has run out in 2020. So now we're working only within the NRC. NRC is continuing the project internally, but we don't know for how long. So right now we're mostly working on releasing everything we've done as open source and making it easier to use, so that other people, communities or researchers, can pick it up and carry it on. But I think it would definitely be it would be good if we could continue working on this area, because it took a while to ramp up. It would be nice not to lose the momentum.
I think so too. I mean, I think there's a lot of exciting prospects of what could come from it. I guess I'm wondering as well, like how broader government initiatives might impact the work. I know there was recently an Indigenous Languages Act that was passed. Has that had any impact?
It hadn't had, it's great that the act was passed, but it hadn't had much impact on our work, just mostly because the project, as I said, it finished in March 2020, and the Indigenous Languages Act was passed, I believe, in the fall of 2019. So we just, the project preceded the act, basically. But, now that the act is in place, one would hope that there will be measures and funding initiatives and kind of consistent effort to support Indigenous languages in Canada.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I mean, hopefully there's additional policy that can help support this initiative as well. One thing I'm curious about, in addition to that, is, and I imagine some of this work has potentially been seen by other countries who want to do some work around the preservation of Indigenous languages, maybe applying technology to that pursuit. Have you seen your work impact some of the work going on in other countries, or even vice versa?
It's still a little early to say. There's definitely a lot of cross-pollination, and for sure, it's surprising how international the language preservation community is. There's a biennial conference that usually happens in Hawaii, and I forget the name. I think it's the International Conference on Language Preservation and something else, but it's kind of the big event that people who are in this field go to. So we've definitely had some really interesting discussions and conversations. I don't know per se that anybody's using our software yet, but as well, our software has not been released that long ago, so it's quite possible that. But I think ideas for, in particular for this project, I think how the project was structured and the fact that it was the Canadian government that gave this funding for 3 years. I think that as well had it piqued interest, and people were influenced by that in other countries. That's the way to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely excited to see, what may continue to happen there. As you mentioned, there's some early collaboration, some early influence, but hopefully that will only grow over time. And more broadly, so thinking about some of the common tech that people are using around the world, things like smart speakers, like let's say Alexa or Google Home, in the context of language and in the work that you're doing, do those kind of devices play a role at all, or are you ever making use of them?
For now, only small use, and I'll elaborate, but in the long run, it would actually be, such devices would actually be a very good avenue for research like this. And the reason is that Indigenous languages in Canada in particular, they have oral tradition of several thousand years, but the written tradition is quite recent, usually less than 100 years or about 100 years. So it would be only natural to work with speech and not with text. Unfortunately, working with speech is technically, it's not even necessarily that it's more challenging, but it is more data intensive. And one of the big challenges we've had in this project is extreme data scarcity in terms of, I said that there are recordings. Yes, there are recordings, but to train, a good kind of state-of-the-art speech recognizer, you probably need about 1,000 hours or several thousand hours of recordings. And I don't know of any Indigenous language in Canada that has that amount of data or even close to it. However, as I said, we've started working on speech recognition side with audio segmenting and audio indexing. And right now, and also we've started working on speech synthesis. So if you have text, how to pronounce it. It is more experimental part of our project just because it's more challenging. But my colleague, Aidan Pine, he's working on synthesizing audio for several languages in Canada. And he's tried, he has some promising results for Mohawk in particular. And he's also working on BC, on at least one BC language, which is more challenging for speech synthesis because the phonological inventory is it's quite big and quite particular. So maybe eventually, but it's kind of our maybe ideally that's our goal in several years, in a good number of years, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, that's kind of where my mind jumps to next is, in 5-10 years, what could that future look like? Is it possible that in the context of language communication, maybe we'll even have, like a universal communicator, almost like in Star Trek? I know even I'm sure you've seen or heard of some of these advancements, but there's like I think the Skype integration that can like live translate. I'd even seen people holding up like Google Translate in between them and speaking into it, and then it speaks back out to the other person in their respective languages. And any thoughts on what might be better or more available in 5 to 10 years?
I'm not usually very good at prophesizing, but without so I may be wrong, but without a doubt, just the advance of language technology, both speech and text, in the last 10 years, it has been staggering. I maybe 5-10 years is a little bit of a short horizon, but maybe in a few more years, I think, the speech component of communication devices, it probably is not going to get to universal communicator, but I imagine it will be pretty good. But what I think we still lack in terms of technology is the reasoning part, because right now, if you look at even devices, like Alexa and Siri and, the translation, on the fly translation, you can ask factual things about that can be mined from a data set, but you cannot ask, even with robots, you cannot ask to reason easily about the surroundings. In any case, the capability is not anywhere near that of a human. And because of that, I think, the universal communicator is still a little bit away. But having said that, I have not watched Star Trek, so I'm not sure exactly what you.
Yeah, maybe we can call Captain Picard. That's really fascinating, fantastic. I appreciate you providing some realism, but also indulging the fantasy that maybe this will one day exist. Maybe last question, a bit of a joke, but just wondering if you also think that maybe our machines will truly get sarcasm and humor and all the different tones and emotions that humans can experience.
There's a lot of work on computational humor, and it's a really interesting field. But again, to my mind, when you say really get something, to my mind, it really means that not only would the program identify that there is a humorous element in a sentence, but to really get what this is about, I don't think we're quite there yet, and it's probably going to come after. I think the prerequisite for fairly elaborate reasoning technology, it would have to come before really understanding humor. That's my thought.
I think it will be really interesting, as maybe more and more machines can understand, what do we really need, how that might affect communication. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I actually didn't know that there was work being done on computational humor. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, there is. It's quite nice.
Well, Anna, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's, as I say, the pleasure is mine. It's an honor.
Well, fantastic. And thank you for all the great work you do for Canada and our Indigenous communities. And also for the podcast, thanks as always to our generous sponsors, including Microsoft Canada. They host a free AI business school where you can learn how to drive business impact by creating an effective AI strategy, enabling an AI-ready culture, and innovating responsibly. Our thanks also go out to Sinchi, the global leader in data-aware technology that makes data integration obsolete to accelerate hundreds of AI projects. And also thanks to our sponsor, Scriptswap. They are an AI-powered jargon buster tool that simplifies business contracts with simple language and formatting recommendations. And in fact, I think you would find Scriptswap particularly interesting. So you might want to check them out.
I think I will.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thanks again to you and to all of our listeners. This has been another episode of the Ask AI podcast, and we wish you all well. Tune in next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Ask AI podcast. The sponsors of this episode were Microsoft Canada, producers of the free AI Business School, and Sinchi, the dataware platform that makes integration obsolete. The series producer was Chris McClellan. The series editor was James Fajardo. Original music was provided by Mike Letourneau. To learn how to be featured on our podcast and get information about sponsorship and volunteering opportunities, please visit our website at askai.org, send us an email to info@askai.org, or talk to our bot by visiting askai.org/chatbot.